So I would like to welcome all of those who are joining us now. And I'm Ron Duncan Hart of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series. And today's talk will be with Dr. Shulamit Reinharz, a leading American sociologist from Brandeis University. As we approach Holocaust Remembrance Day, which will be on starting tomorrow evening, Dr. Reinharz will share this unique account of surviving the Holocaust from her own family. Her book with the same title as today's talk is in publication, and later on perhaps she can give us more information about that. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Shulamit Reinharz to Santa Fe virtually this time for the webinar after she was here in person with the Santa Fe Jewish Film Festival a number of years ago. I've had the pleasure of knowing and working with Dr. Reinharz for more than a dozen years, appreciating her passion for women's studies and social justice. She's a retired Jacob Podolsky Professor of Sociology at Brandeis and the founding director of the Hadassah Brandeis Institute. Dr. Reinharz is the child of Holocaust survivors, having been born in Amsterdam shortly after the war. As a professional sociologist, she's a leader in women's studies. She chaired the National Commission on American Jewish Women and was the chair of the Women's Studies program at Brandeis. She co-founded and co-edited the journal Nashim, which is focused on Jewish gender studies. She's the author of a dozen books ranging from kibbutz life to women's studies and methodology. And it is a genuine pleasure for me, Shula, to welcome you here to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series today.
Thank you very much, Ron. Thank you for inviting me to speak on hiding during the Holocaust. This talk is based on my book, due to come out in 2024. In order to write it, I used a vast variety of primary materials, the most important of which were a memoir, documents such as report cards, numerous diaries, extensive correspondence, photographs, secondary literature, interviews, travel to relevant sites, archives, and more. Hiding during the Holocaust deals with a phenomenon that took place between 1942 and 1945 all over Europe. My book deals with one country, Holland. I wrote this book to tell my father's story, but as I wrote it, I realized that hiding, whether literally underground or under a false identity, is an important phenomenon of the Holocaust and in Jewish history more generally. You already know about this if you live in the Southwest because of the emergence of formerly hidden crypto-Jews in the Southwest. There is a debate about how many Jews hid in Holland. The most reliable number is 28,000 people. And how many survived? Approximately 8,000 people. So it was not a sure bet that if you went into hiding, you would survive. Before the war, and this is very important for everyone to understand, there were 140,000 Jews in the Netherlands. Of those 140,000, 85% were killed. That is the highest number in Western Europe. By two contrasting examples, France lost 40% of its Jews, and Germany 25%. Holland 85%. More Jews, however, survived in Holland by hiding than by any other means. The only better way to survive was to flee Europe. Even conversion or intermarriage didn't help. For a short while, sterilization did help. As we all know, Hitler launched his war against the Jews in January 1933, when he gained absolute power in Germany. He then used the law illegally completely illegally to subjugate, rob, and then murder the Jews of Europe. 9 years later, on January 20th, 1942, after Hitler's wars against the world, which was World War II, and against the Jews, which was the Holocaust, were already proceeding full steam ahead. The SS leadership, including Adolf Eichmann, met in a villa outside Berlin called Wannsee and endorsed the final solution to murder every single European Jew. And that's when the dates 1942 to 1945 became important. That anyone survived at all in Holland is extraordinary. In 1920, my father, Max Rothschild, was born in Gunzenhausen, a typical religiously a devout Christian, backward-looking, superstitious town of 5,000 citizens that included 200 traditional religious Jews. This is the center of the town. Gunzenhausen means the houses of the geese. It's a rural town, a farming town. Gunzenhausen had all the facilities a Jewish community needed. A shochet, or butcher, a mikveh, a beit kavarot, or cemetery, an elementary school, a magnificent, imposing synagogue. This is for 200 Jews, if you can imagine that. Replete with the onion domes, which were torn down during Kristallnacht. And it had, of course, a mohel, or circumciser, who performed the deed on the little boy who would become my father. This is a mohel's book. And where you see the purple arrow is where my father's name, I don't know if you can see it, Max Rothschild, is written, proving that he had his Brit Milah. The only thing it didn't have was a full-time rabbi. Maybe if they had, he would have gotten the Jews of Gunzenhausen to recognize reality and leave. But they had no enlightened leadership. Gunzenhausen became famous as the town that created the first Nazi-inspired pogrom. Max left Gunzenhausen not long after his bar mitzvah and moved in with his grandmother in Munich, a kind of what I call internal migration that his father thought would provide Dad with a safer place than was Gunzenhausen, because Munich was cosmopolitan. By 1939, Gunzenhausen had become 100% Judenrein, which means there was not a single Jew living there, and there has been none to this day. In the next slide, you can see where the houses were in which the Jews lived. The slide was created by contemporary Gunzenhausen school children as a project to help them develop knowledge and empathy. Many of these students come from Arab nations. What you can see from this is also that the Jews of Gunzenhausen were not ghettoized. They lived among their Christian neighbors. My father's father was their physician. He lamented the fact that he delivered babies who became vicious Nazis. He said, "I wish I would have strangled them at birth," which of course he didn't do. 3 life-changing events occurred when Dad moved to Munich. First, he joined a Zionist youth organization called Habonim, which means in Hebrew, the builders. He loved this group with all his heart. And as a member, he learned to see himself in a new light in that group, as a valuable Jewish boy who was smart, had leadership qualities, loved the Hebrew language, and in no way was the Unglück, or misfortune, of the nation, as Hitler labeled him. In Habonim, Dad gave up what he considered the passivity of Judaism for the assertive approach of Zionism. Second, in Habonim, he met Ilse Strauss, a German Jewish girl with whom he fell head over heels in love and who became his partner until they both died at age 92, 1 week apart. And third, he decided spontaneously to engage in an act of resistance. This was not a sudden taking up of arms or blowing up of a bridge, but that's not the only kind of resistance. Rather, it happened during his Abitur, which is the nationwide high school graduation exam. He simply refused to answer a question, thereby getting a D in his strongest subject, English. His act brought down the school grade average, and he was forbidden to participate in his graduation. The assignment was to demonstrate mastery in the field of quote unquote English literature by translating a section of Hitler's Mein Kampf, which accuses Jews of shirking their duty to Germany in World War I. My father, Max, knew this was a lie. After all, he had been named for his 18-year-old uncle Max, who had lost his life fighting for the Germans. From that moment on, he resisted the Germans in whatever way he could and at whatever cost. When Dad finished high school in Munich, he joined Ilse, his girlfriend, on a Zionist farm in a northeast German town called Erfurt. There, they would learn agricultural skills in preparation for their new life in the Jewish Yeshuv of Palestine. This farm was called a hachshara, the Hebrew word for preparation. In 1938, there were numerous hachsharot in Europe. The hachshara offered Max and Ilse 3 wonderful things: to be together unsupervised, to learn agricultural skills. This is his girlfriend, Ilse, who became my mother, and to study. What could be better? Max had a special ability to make a friend wherever he went. His relations with Jews and non-Jews saved his life. People without social networks could not survive. In Elgut, Max befriended an extraordinary young Jewish man named Joachim Simon, which is this picture here, with the nickname Shushu, his best friend until a few years later, when Shushu slit his wrists lest he divulge information under torture. On the farm, Shushu and Max thought life was nearly perfect. The outside world did not matter to them. Shushu was well-versed in Hebrew, as was my father. They studied into the night, danced, sang, and bonded. In fall 1938, Max and Ilse returned from the Hachshara to Munich to be with their parents for the high holidays. Recently, the Germans had rescinded the citizenship of Jewish people originally from Poland and then expelled them from Germany. My father in Munich witnessed the open trucks crammed with Jews being taken to the Polish border and tried to help them. 2 of these people were the parents of Herschel Grinspan, a young Jew who vowed to murder a German consular bureaucrat in Paris in response to the German treatment of his parents. In response to that murder, the German government carried out Kristallnacht on November 9th and 10th, 1938. By this point, Max and Ilse had just gotten back to Elgut. On Kristallnacht, my mother, father, Shushu, and the whole Hachshara group of around 100 young Jews was beaten and terrorized by neighbors of the farm. The Nazi activities there on Kristallnacht were not carefully organized. The young Nazis just wanted the Jews to go to Poland, and the Polish border guards said they didn't want to let them in. They said, "We have too many Jews already." The Hachshara girls ultimately were allowed to go home, and the boys were boarded onto trains going west, but at least not east into Poland. But what was in the west? The concentration camp Buchenwald. Look at that slide, where everyone looks the same. They're all dehumanized. 10,000 Jewish boys and men were sent to Buchenwald. There they were beaten and forced to witness a young Jew whipped almost to death by numerous guards. It's not necessary for me to describe additional aspects of a concentration camp. The next slide shows Otto Koch. He was on the right. He's the commander of Buchenwald and his family. The picture was taken to humanize him. My father was interrogated by Koch. Sitting with his cronies in his office, the men asked my father what he saw while he watched his father, the doctor, conduct gynecological exams. The men wanted to masturbate, which they did with abandon. One thing to point out is that when a crowd this huge is assembled, it is likely that some people will find each other. Thus, Shushu and my father found each other and actually lived together in the same bunk. How did my father get out of Buchenwald? There are many theories. The most likely one was that the Germans did not want to feed the Jews in the camp any longer. Instead, they wanted to terrorize their relatives outside the camp and compel them to depart Germany, leaving their wealth behind. My father was imprisoned in Buchenwald for 5 weeks minus 2 hours. Because his stay was 2 hours less than the minimum, he never was able to receive restitution for his stay. At the same time, there was a Habonim headquarters in Berlin, which knew that all the Jewish kids from Elgut were, the boys, I should say, were in Buchenwald, and they turned to their sister organizations in other countries for help. It turns out that in the Netherlands, a long-standing Zionist organization in the town of Deventer had worked out a scheme that brought in German Jewish youth who had some agricultural experience and placed them on Dutch farms. Both Max and Ilse were able to cross the border into the Netherlands and were placed legally and were placed on separate farms on the condition that they leave Holland within 2 years. They became what I call pass-through refugees, exploited financially and made to do dangerous work. They were not immigrants. They ate with the farm owners' families, they learned Dutch, and all the Zionists on these various farms met biweekly as a large group and gave each other moral support. These are paintings of Van Gogh, one of the most famous Dutch painters, of farmers in that area. I don't know if the farmers that my parents worked for looked like them. Max and Ilse arrived in Holland in January and March 1939, thinking mistakenly that they had found permanent freedom. Instead, it was short-lived. In May 1940, the Germans invaded Norway, Denmark, Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and then France, with the goal of launching an attack on Great Britain. When the Dutch surrendered after a few days, the Germans imposed all the restrictions on the Jews that they had experienced in Germany, even though the Germans said they would not do so. The Dutch naively had believed Germany would honor its peace agreement with them, but that was simply a German ruse to lower Dutch defenses. A couple of days after the invasion that occurred on May 10th, 1945, the Dutch Queen, Wilhelmina, fled to England, where she spent the war years in relative comfort and did nothing at all to help the Jewish citizens or refugees in her country. Frustrated on his farm, Dad sought new opportunities where he could learn a skill. So he went to Amsterdam and worked in an auto shop. But one day, when he went to his regular cafe for lunch, he found a pitched battle going on between Jewish youth and Dutch Nazis. The Dutch Nazis were the largest Nazi group of any country in Europe other than Germany. And they formed a whole component of the Nazi operation in Holland. The Nazis rounded up 400 Jewish boys, sent them to concentration camp Mauthausen, where they died soon of exhaustion from carrying the stones up the steps of the quarry and down again. Max left Amsterdam as soon as possible after that riot to return to the farms in Almelo on the border with Germany. And you can see Dad is here back milking cows. And I don't know if you can tell, but he has on wooden shoes. And he looks relatively happy. In summer, Dad knew that in order to survive, he had to defy, not obey. But there's certain things he did obey. He had to have a pass on his person at all times. Here's a false pass with a J, which stands for Joodse, which is the Dutch word for Jew. And that's a picture of my father. It looks nothing like the person whose pass this really is. And you can see it was made out to him in Amsterdam on the 6th of October in 1942. In summer 1942, my father was working on a farm when he learned that the Nazi occupying government was about to send all the Jews in Holland a mimeographed slip in the mail telling them to report to a particular collection point in order to participate in the Harvest Help program. No one knew what the program was, but all the Jews complied. A few days later, Shushu came to visit Dad on the farm and urged him not to comply, but rather to hide. Dad was convinced by Shushu that he was right and agreed to hide. I have broken down the process into 4 simple steps. First step, understand the need to hide and make the decision to hide. Don't turn back. For most people, this was the most difficult step. They couldn't make the commitment. Number 2, find people who would help you. The crucial idea was that a person could not hide without someone's help. 3, prepare to hide. Find out what you needed to bring, if possible, or bring nothing, if that was better. 4, actually hide. In other words, you hide after you've gone through those other 3 steps. 95% of the Jews complied with the roundup order. This is why the number of Jews killed in Holland was so great, because the Jews didn't know what was going on. They were constantly deceived, and they complied. On August 16th, 1942, Max and Ilse were part of the 28,000 person group that, as they say in Holland, dove underground. 8,000 survived. As it turned out, this was the group with the highest survival rate of Jews in Holland, as I said before. When Dad received his notice, and you have to remember he's 19 years old at the time, he became so furious that he tore it into pieces, put it back in the envelope, sealed it, put his return address on it, and mailed it back. No foreign intelligence helped those trying to decide whether to hide or not. When Max received the call-up slip, the first farmer for whom he had worked offered to help him. From the beginning of his stay in Holland, and Mom's as well, they had befriended trustworthy non-Jewish Dutch people in the Almelo farming region. A Jew with no Gentile friends during the occupation was doomed. Dad's first farmer brought him to another Gentile Dutchman, but strangely, almost comically, this guy turned out to be homeless. And so he was hidden by a homeless guy in haylofts. Dad had to change hiding places many times. This meant that a flexible network of rescuers and hiding places always had to be available. Clearly, it took a village to save a Jew in hiding. Irena Sendler, a Polish Gentile rescuer of Jewish babies and children in the Warsaw Ghetto, calculated the relationship. To save one Jewish child, 10 Poles and 2 Jews had to risk death. Hiding people was not a one-size-fits-all operation. People hid as individuals, as a couple, as families, as groups of families like Anne Frank, as strangers, as young children alone, in the cities and in the countryside, among other variations. Each individual or group had its own needs, and each person required a series of hiding places because a good site could become dangerous at a moment's notice or over time. Dad's second hiding place was as weird as the first one. His second hiding place was a brothel. And finally, his third hiding place was in somebody's home. Dad wrote, "When I got to the Beisterbusch house, I found a fellow Havonim member already there. I had no idea that he had gone into hiding, and certainly that we were going to hide together. Given the large number of similarities with my situation, my surprise at finding this man there in the hiding place in which I would be placed was a testament to the discipline of secrecy, even among the tight-knit group of German Jewish Zionist refugees. This man and my father lived together in the attic room of the B's house for close to 2 years, and they did not like each other." He wrote, "Imagine living in an attic room for nearly 2 years with another person you have not chosen and who turns out to get on your nerves. The stress of hiding together began to show early on. We became irritable and were quick to insult each other. Sometimes we would not speak or even whisper to each other for days on end. And then something weird happened. All of a sudden, after a few weeks, both of us felt free." Dad wrote, "For the first time, I felt free from the farmer for whom I worked, free from the constant fear of a call-up, free from all the small and large pressures and uncertainties of my everyday life as a farmhand. I know this will sound paradoxical, but I also know that these were my true feelings at the time. Finally, at long last, having made my decision to go into hiding and not be pushed around any longer, I felt free. This no Nazi could take away from me. I had made my choice. It was my decision and nobody else's, not to go to a work camp to help with the harvest. I felt spiritually free. At long last, I could read, write, and think." Nevertheless, the solitary acts of reading, writing, and thinking were the only of activities available after the chores and nightly card games with their host ended. And we always had to go about barefoot or just in socks. I learned to peel potatoes and apples and to wind up wool. I learned to play the simple card game, which we had to suffer through almost every evening with the old boss. I did not pray at that time. Being Jewish was no longer a religious question for me, and Zionism even had not much meaning for me either. Survival was everything. Our room could not be heated during the winter for reasons of safety. It could not be aired much in the summer either. But besides the quarrels and the times when we got on each other's nerves, besides the occasional moments of despair, there were also times of joy, or at least good humor. Both of us tried desperately to bring a sense of normalcy into our relationship with each other. There were shared fears and hopes, dreams about a future of freedom, as well as a constant looking backwards into a rosy past that truly never was. There was lots of talk about food, about all the good things our mothers used to make for us, and about girlfriends, love affairs, and such. Two things that gave us strength: encouraging war news, especially news of German losses and retreats, and visits from our helpers. Just talking to them and talking not about current problems, but getting books from them and discussing the books and getting an occasional letter or news from people we knew. Books were our vitamins, or if you will, our adrenaline shots. I read everything: French novels, German history books, philosophy, travel logs, language books and readers, health instructions. I even taught myself Russian. In the attic, I kept a diary in Dutch titled From the Hidden, a War Diary 1942-44. Most of its 60 pages are devoted to political or psychological philosophy, to socialism, capitalism, humanism, Judaism, optimism, nature, and more. I was as interested in the future of the German people as in their current and previous inhuman behavior. The question that obsessed me in hiding was whether the German character, as revealed during the Holocaust, was permanent and immutable, or if it was possible for Germans to change. Was Germany salvageable? Could German schools teach students to think independently and creatively? Another activity between card playing, wool unraveling, and all these other activities I just mentioned was building hideouts within hideouts. This is a piece of wood, which is a cover for something over which there was a rug. Here somebody is pushing away the rug. Do you see below is the cover we saw before. And you see that the woman has her hand going into something below that. And this is what it was, a shaft going from the attic to the basement. Wherever my father was, he always built a hideout within a hideout. We were lucky that we were young in the first place and that we lived in the countryside and not in Amsterdam, where chances to hide were much more limited. We had to be absolutely silent, of course, in the little worker's house that looked like all the others, attached so closely on both sides that you could hear the neighbors snoring on both sides. Our hosts brought our food upstairs to us at set times. Of course, we had to be on the lookout constantly for German soldiers and police and listen for unfamiliar noises. I suffered particularly from the frequent air raids. We were alone. There was never any expression of friendship or sympathy, no brotherly encouragement to those in hiding from the Allied broadcasts. Our help, and I refer here not only to practical help, but to psychological support, came only and exclusively from our Dutch friends in the Dutch resistance. Here we made new friends, and many of them. These friendships, tested in periods of the greatest adversity and danger, have outlasted the long war, and they will endure as long as we live. Our hosts were quiet old people whose every movement had been known by their neighbors for years. Now their toilets were flushed more frequently. The garbage cans would fill up faster. Water would run longer. 100 little things, each quite insignificant in and of itself, but potentially dangerous when taken all together by a nosy blabbermouth. On rare occasion, my attic mate and I would be taken for a brief walk in the dark of night. This was not without risk, but it helped us physically and mentally. From my diary in hiding, I wrote, "What is the hardest thing about hiding?" Answer, to sit idly by while other comrades do something. We read and read. We imagined that we are preparing ourselves, but we are not. We are merely preserving ourselves. He wrote, amidst all the suffering, we, my community of Zionist Jews, are happy to be alive. He wrote, hiding is my voluntary prison. He wrote, 2 springs and summers without seeing any blue sky, without taking a breath of fresh air, always speaking in whispered tones and hardly moving. Dad hid well. He was not caught. He was not sent to one of the several Dutch concentration camps, which some people don't realize Holland had. The worst was Vught and Westerbork was the busiest, which sent almost all the Jews to their death. Thank God for Shushu, who convinced me to hide, Dad wrote. Thank God for each person who hid me. Thank God for the neighbors who did not betray me. They might have realized I was hiding there, but they did not betray me. Thank God for my ability to endure the prison of idleness. But on the second anniversary of hiding, I simply could not take it any longer. Against all reason, I sought a way to leave and return to Amsterdam, the place from which all the Dutch Jews and German Jewish refugees were funneled to Westerbork. What drove me to take this risk? And what allowed my organization's decision-making committee to allow it? Longing for my girlfriend, Ilse Herta Strauss. As the war dragged on, the hunt for Jews in hiding became frantic. Eichmann was determined to make Holland Judenrein, and he rejected all special pleas. Every Jewish man, woman, or child had to be deported and killed. Eichmann seemed fearful that even one remaining Jew would become the source of a Jewish Renaissance. Through a long and circuitous project to enable Max and Ilse to live together, they were each taken to Rotterdam. Their helpers and hiders were two people, Nick and Ach Schouden, who became their best friends for the rest of their lives, and whom they arranged to be honored at Yad Vashem. When accepting his recognition after years of my parents trying to persuade them to do so, Nick explained what made him do it. He said, "It was the end of 1942 when I saw how a group of Jews was assembled in South Rotterdam, ready for deportation. As an individual, I was powerless to oppose such an act of violence. What the individual or family could do, however, was to help Jewish people go into hiding so that they at least would be spared such a fate. My motto was, don't kill a perpetrator, save a potential victim." My mother bleached her hair, got a false identity card with the name Tina Resser, and was able to be outside to search for food. My father was never able to go outside in daylight. He looked too Jewish. You all know that on June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allied forces stormed the Normandy beaches in France. They chased the Germans back into Holland. But actual victory would take almost another life-endangering year. The Dutch government in exile decided to retaliate against the German offensive in the South by ordering a universal railway strike. All railway personnel obeyed, but the Germans turned the deed to their own advantage by closing Dutch agricultural provinces and imposing an embargo on all provisions. By this closing, and also because the Germans took away every means of transport, the Western District, where the big cities of Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht, and The Hague were located, were doomed to hunger. The short-sighted Dutch National Railway strike to punish the Germans ended up punishing the Dutch as well. At Nick and Ach's suggestion, Max and Ilse moved to Nick's parents' little house in Rotterdam when Ach gave birth to their second child, and where Max and Ilse had no task other than to take care of themselves. Throughout the country, because it was so cold and because everyone was so hungry, people began burning trees, burning floor beams, railroad tracks, anything that could generate heat during what was called the hunger and cold winter. Women in skimpy coats and broken shoes dug up tulip bulbs or beets or trekked miles to farms to find food. A public health official calculated that there were fewer calories per person in this last year of the war in Holland than were available in Auschwitz. The raids continued. During one raid on their house, my mother saved my father's life. But then the dam burst again. They could not tolerate taking care only of their own needs. They were determined to join the organized resistance. My father published a newspaper as part of the resistance for the Communist Party, and my mother became a courier. There were more clandestine newspapers in the Netherlands than anywhere else in Europe. One last story. As the war dragged to a close, some German soldiers decided to desert so that when the war ended, they could say that they had been friends of the Dutch. My father's interest in the future of Germany led him to want to get to know a deserter. He found one, Ludwig, whom he met under cover of darkness twice a week. Somehow that deserter was betrayed, and the whole family with whom he hid were murdered. My father, for some reason, had stayed home that particular night, had not met Ludwig, and was spared. On May 5th, 1945, the Germans surrendered in the Rotterdam area, the last place in Europe that the Germans occupied. The 8,000 Jews who survived by hiding emerged from their hiding places, and about 5,000 Jews straggled back from concentration camps to resume their lives. But it took a long time, maybe never, for life to return to what might be called normal. My father called this period the after-war disaster. When the war ended, Dad realized it meant something different to Dutch non-Jews and Dutch Jews. Non-Jews had seen much of their country destroyed and many of their fellow Nederlanders killed. For Jews, their entire community had been exterminated and their future aborted by the loss of so many children. Many more, the percentage of children, Jewish children who were killed in the Holocaust was greater than the percentage of Jewish adults. It was difficult to communicate with his parents, but finally, someone was able to send a telegram. This is the telegram that told my father's parents, who had made it to the US, the following: Max Rothschild and fiancé well. That was it. Max Rothschild and fiancé well. 5 words to announce that they had survived. My parents spent 8 months trying to get permission to marry. Finally, I was born in June 1946. New Jewish life, just as the Nazis had feared. My mother is 4 months pregnant there at the time. By virtue of a network of Jewish and Christian friends and helpers, organizations, resourcefulness, miracles, and luck, Ilsa and I, my father wrote, had survived in the Western Europe country with the highest rate of Jewish extermination, the country that was last to be liberated, the country whose operations to kill Jews, SS officer Reinhard Heydrich considered to be, quote, a model for other nations to follow, close quote, a model that was almost perfect in exterminating the Jews in the Netherlands, except for those who went into hiding and the few that returned from the concentration camp. In January 1947, after unimaginable trouble in obtaining visas to go to the United States from Holland, even though my father's parents lived there already and had become citizens, my parents and I, then 7 months old, were able to leave. By this point, my father had done the following: helped my mother deal with repeated, extremely difficult illnesses, had located Jewish children in hiding, and helped return them to their biological parents. He had visited his hometown of Gunzenhausen and Munich. He had found people whose whereabouts had been unknown, and he had become a professional journalist reporting on the proceedings of the 22nd World Zionist Congress, the first one after the war. Dad had also tracked down what happened to my mother's parents. Both were murdered in France in the concentration camp Gurs, and he had conducted a voluminous correspondence. In the United States, my father was reunited with his parents and two sisters. He decided to earn a PhD and then be ordained privately as a rabbi and work for the conservative movement. My parents spent a year in Israel where my sister was born. On the surface, everything was fine. But once in a while, he would tell me, apropos nothing, about a hiding space he had found recently in New Jersey, or about a person he thought would hide us. My father told endless jokes about people, especially those who were pompous and didn't know what they were talking about. Ours was a Holocaust home. It was Dad's favorite topic. On January 18th, 2013, my father died in Fort Lee, New Jersey, 1 month shy of his 92nd birthday. Although I am grateful that my father lived to a ripe old age, I wish he would have lived another 7 years until 2020. If he had, then he would have learned that on May 4th, 2020, King Willem-Alexander of the Netherlands acknowledged that his great-grandmother, Wilhelmina, her indifference to the fate of Dutch Jews during the Holocaust was a crime. It is something that won't let me go, he said. 4 months earlier, Prime Minister Mark Rutte apologized for how his kingdom's wartime government failed its Jews. It had taken 75 years. Now the world could know the truth. The Netherlands were not good to their Jews, not at all. Right before Dad died, I asked him if there was a particular lesson he wanted me to derive from the Holocaust. Without stopping to think, he said, quote, "There are some good people in this world," close quote. He knew this because Mom's and his lives had been saved by good people. It was the behavior of these people, these unusually good but modest people, that allowed a remnant of the Jewish people to survive. According to Jewish tradition, the world continues to exist because a few good individuals exist. Thank you.
Thank you for walking us through this. And I'm impressed by your father's comments as he was nearing the end of his life about the good people in the world.
You know, Ron, that Anne Frank said, there's a little bit of good in everybody. And she is adored for having said that. I asked my father what he thought about that. He said, it's not true. And we have to accept that.
Yeah. The other thing that really caught my attention is for one person to survive, for one child to survive, it took 10 people. And
2 Jews.
And 2 Jews. Incredible. You know, that there had to be a network, literally, for one child who survived. You know? And your father obviously had they were not just the people that he was staying with, but there were other supporters that you mentioned, no? That's
right. Supporters of supporters of supporters going back, you know what I mean?
Yes, right. Yeah. So we don't, I mean, I don't often think about that in terms, or haven't realized that how much the network was there. You know, the like the root system that was under the surface.
Right.
Making this possible, no?
Right. Well, you can imagine, let's say there was one person supplying food and that person was killed. Then what?
Yeah.
You had to have a backup and a backup of a backup.
Right, right. So we have some questions. One is from someone who's anonymous, didn't give the name, but I would love to hear more about those who hid your father at the risk of their own lives. I don't know how much information you have on the families of the people that hid them. You told more about at the end when your mother and father were together and that couple. But,
so the people who saved my father were, The first one was a guy just hated Nazis. And he would just do it for that reason. Didn't particularly love Jews or even know Jews. But if the Jews hated the Nazis, if the Nazis hated the Jews, then he hated the Nazis. There were people, and they were farmers. They were not sophisticated people. They didn't have a whole philosophy. It was extraordinary. My mother went to somebody before she went into hiding and said, she was a social worker. And she said, you know, I probably have to hide. I don't know what to do. The woman says, you hide with me.
Huh.
Do we ourselves have that capacity? Do we have the capacity to take people in whose lives are endangered? Now, they were all living in a war situation. They were all suffering. But there were also people who were Nazi Dutch people. And they would, I didn't even talk about this. They would hand in Jews and get the equivalent of a stein of beer.
Hey. Oh.
There was even a case of a person who hid Jews for the purpose of handing them over. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, right.
But the brothel owner, who knows why he did it? Who knows? I don't know. You know, maybe these people are sometimes social outcasts. They don't care. They're just going to do it because they hate the people who are oppressing them.
Yeah.
And then there was the people who hid them, in their house, and then took them to another house. They were idealists. He was the man who said, "Don't kill a perpetrator, save a victim."
Yeah.
You know, he had an idea. Not everybody is on the same level of intelligence or commitment or ideology. People do things for different reasons.
And the incredible thing, you're mentioning so many of these people were farmers.
Yes, they were farmers. But the people in Rotterdam were city dwellers.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to show you something. As I said, the Dutch, the Dutch had the highest rate of murder of Jews of any Western country. Okay.
Yeah.
And I want to just see if I have some of the numbers here for you. It doesn't matter. But on the other hand, Ron, at the same time, they had a very large number of people they saved.
Yes.
So
yeah.
these,
With
I think,
extraordinary effort.
the highest other than Poland.
Yeah.
So here are two books. I don't know if you can see them. They're big fat tomes.
Yes.
Published by Yad Vashem. And it's called Rescuer of Jews during the Holocaust, the Netherlands. You have page after page of people who saved Jews. And in this book, there are some I know who saved Jews, like the social worker that I told you, who are not here. So there's even more.
So there are more.
Here we have the Schoutens. Can you see that?
Yes, I see. Yeah, up just a bit. Yeah.
Okay, so it's just a story about the Schoutens, and it mentions my parents. It says, with regard to motivation, which you just talked about, well, Nick and Schouten behaved as they did because they understood the gravity and the truth of what was happening around them and felt it was their duty to save lives. They were prepared to accept the possible consequences of their actions. They understood the gravity and the truth, and it was their duty to save lives. I don't know how many people feel it's the duty to save lives. These were Jews, you know. The Schoutens probably didn't even know any Jews before that.
Yeah.
And they loved my parents, and my parents loved them, and they spent countless summers together afterwards.
That's
My
incredible.
parents,
They became twins. Yeah.
my parents paid for their children's college education, etc. They did whatever they could. How do you pay? Thank you for saving my life.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Is
You know,
there
there
another?
are a couple of questions here that that coincide. One comes from Gloria Bellabella, and then the other is anonymous. But both are asking, what was your experience living with Holocaust survivors, and how did that affect you from your perception? How do you see that's affected you in your life?
Well, I think I mentioned that I called my house a Holocaust home. You know, it was part of everyday conversation. And I liked learning. I think I was somewhat horrified by the stories when I was a little kid. But I had some bad dreams and bad associations. But in general, I just like learning more and more and more. In third grade, for example, I remember I was, let's see if I have this here. Yeah. You know how you have show and tell in
Yeah.
third grade? So I went there, and when I was little, I had black hair. And I stood up in front of the class and I said, I am a Dutch girl, which was really strange. And I said, and I can prove it. And it was this thing, I kept it, which is a kind of, it's broken now, but it was a windmill.
Yes, yes, right. I can
And
see.
I said, this proves that I'm Dutch, which is ridiculous, of course, but it was a third grade conception of what it meant to me to belong to this family, right? So many things. I'll just tell you one other story about this. My family, as I mentioned in the very beginning, came from Germany, right? And my grandparents got out in 39 and got to Malden, Massachusetts. And when they got, my grandparents were friendly people. My grandfather was a doctor, and his wife was a great cook, and they would have parties and they would meet people. And so they had a little community. None of the people in their German Jewish community had children.
Oh, wow. Wow.
I was very aware of the fact that if you lived through the Holocaust, I don't know what I called it at the time, or if you came from Germany, I might have said, you were likely not to have children. And I have many pictures of my grandparents with their large group of friends, no children. So I became the child of childless survivors, because all these friends of my grandparents adopted me and my sister and my brother. So we were special. So I had this notion of being special. And I was special because I survived, because I was the grandchildren for so many people. I understood German, but every year I learned a little bit more. And I think the reason I wrote the book is because I now feel I know what I want to know. I had the completely mistaken notion that the Jews were good, excuse me, that the Dutch were good to the Jews because my parents survived there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's not the story.
It's the opposite. Yeah.
Thank you, Ron, for saying that. And so I feel satisfied. I feel, Dayenu. And I accept myself as a second generation, and I feel like I'm part of a special generation, that all of us in this generation have a duty to remember the past. And you know what I'm doing now? I am part of a group of people who live in Gunzenhausen now, that town where my father came from.
Right.
They live there now. Obviously, they're not Jewish because it's Judenrein. And I and other descendants of survivors of that town meet every other week
Oh, wow. Wow.
to talk about everything. And these people in Gunzenhausen, some of whom are very sensitive and wonderful people, they are celebrating 1,200 years of Gunzenhausen. I mean, I don't feel there's anything to celebrate, but that's my business.
Yeah.
And I'm going to the celebration in July. And they are putting on a whole set of events for us.
So this group gets together virtually.
Of course,
yeah.
yes. And I've been there once I visited.
Yeah. Incredible. So Jews and non-Jews are getting together to talk about the history of this town, what happened.
Or the future or the present,
Yeah.
Because it's our shared history. They don't have a different history.
So how do you find them looking at you as descendants of Jews that had to leave the town?
Great question, Ron. I'm not ready to give an answer.
Yeah.
I think they're trying to figure out who the hell we are. Do we hate them? Are we dangerous? What is Judaism anyhow? What is Israel? They're inviting over this Israeli orchestra for us. I mean, I think we're in the exploration stage. There is a mayor in the town. His name is Mr. Fitz. And I apparently offended him when I spoke once, just informally. I said, I don't know what I'm celebrating. What am I going there for? I was just speaking from the heart.
Yeah.
I don't know what this is for. And he thought that was offensive. So, that's okay. It just means we have a lot of work to do.
Oh, yeah. It's not easy.
Not easy at all. But it's worthwhile.
Liz Levine just makes the comment that she's impressed about the people who actually were hiding Jews and
yes.
the selfish and courageous nature of their doing that. Camilla Mandler talks about that her grandparents were also hidden by farmers in Slovakia.
Mm-hmm.
That and giving a part of that, she has a family story coming out of that.
Sometimes farmers were very ignorant and right-wing, and sometimes they were not. You don't know what you're going to get
out of that. Yeah. So Bonnie Ellinger asks, do you have any indication of how many of the surviving Dutch Jews actually made Aliyah to Israel?
Yes, I do. It was a very big Aliyah in the sense of percentage of Jews who went. There's a big Dutch Jewish community in Israel. There's a place called Lochamei HaGetaot, which means ghetto fighters in Hebrew. Now, these Dutch Jews were not ghetto fighters, but the ghetto fighters from Warsaw have sort of adopted them. And that kibbutz has a whole archive and memorial center. It's fabulous. If anyone goes to Israel, they should go there. And I can provide information if they want. And they have all this material about the Dutch. So the love of Israel among Dutch Jews was very high, and a large percentage went there. Just think about it, Ron. What else would they do?
Yeah.
Would they stay in Holland?
Yeah.
How could you stay there?
You can't. Yeah.
If you were a German refugee to Holland, what would you do? Go to Germany? So the two main places were always the US and Palestine.
People had to leave.
Nobody wanted to stay there. My mother said, why would I move to a cemetery?
Yeah.
And I say a cemetery would have been a good alternative to what there really was, which was just ashes. I also wanted to make the point, Ron, maybe I don't know if it came through because I didn't say it, which is the people sort of condense big events into some small things so that they can get a handle on it. And people talk about the Holocaust as if it were Auschwitz. And it's not. It's not only the concentration camps.
Yeah.
And people also don't talk about how did people survive. There were 9 million Jews before the Holocaust, and there were, we say, 6 million Jews who were killed. Who knows what these numbers mean? And 3 million Jews survived.
Yeah.
I don't know if there were 3 million righteous Gentiles. I doubt it. But they survived. I mean, I have books about all different kinds of survival in Berlin and everywhere. Not many in number, but enough to create something afterwards.
You know, one of the things that you mentioned that was interesting about the farm that your parents worked on at one point, that was the preparation. I've forgotten the Hebrew name, but it's the
Hachshara.
And Avinoam Pat actually talked about that, wrote a book on it, which is but his is like the post-war version of it. When you mentioned it, it's a fascinating story that these farms existed, getting people ready for afterwards. Yeah.
Should I tell you something
Sure.
difficult about that?
Yeah.
Think about it. The farms existed to train people to be able to fulfill the Zionist mission in Palestine, right?
Right.
But by having that as the goal, you kept the Jews in Germany.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my father blamed the Zionists for that conviction to this goal of preparation that didn't allow for recognizing that they have to get out now.
Had to get out. Yeah.
It's a terrible debate. So the Hashira was a great thing, but it would have been a great thing not under war conditions.
Yeah.
Everything has two sides to it. My father writes a great deal about that. One of the things I'm proud of that he wrote about was his concern for the Germans. He thinks, yeah, he really feels that they were,
or the future.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
and which is one of the reasons I joined the group. Yeah.
So there is a question that Gloria Abella-Valen brings up about is there a consideration of a Holocaust museum or something like that in the town where you have the working group with the people where you'll be going in July?
Yes.
I mean, I don't know if that's come up in the discussion or.
Yes. There's something called Holocaust activism or Holocaust remembrance activism. It's a new phrase. And it describes people who want to do something to bring recognition of the Holocaust to contemporary Germany. There are many people working on this. And in this town, and it's always spontaneous. Nobody is appointed, to do it. And in this town, Gunzenhausen, a woman who was a teacher of 9th graders said, the kids here don't know a thing about what happened during the Holocaust period. And I think they should. She's a very soft-spoken person. And she said, I'm going to find out if they would be interested. Now, do you remember that I said that the students who did the research were mostly from Arab countries?
Right, right.
Pretty amazing. So all these, Arab kids are now studying the Jewish history of Gunzenhausen, and they have done a great deal. They have an enormous website, which is really very, very good. I can get you the information. The woman's name is Emmy Hetzner. And we've nominated her for prizes, which she has gotten. And in many, many towns in that area, there are people like this, studying the history, putting up a museum, whatever it is. And they have put up in Gunzenhausen a plaque, actually a very beautiful plaque. It's all glass, and chiseled in are the names of every Jew who was killed.
Yeah.
They have a plaque on the synagogue, remains, I think. I don't remember exactly, but they have a cemetery which they're trying to preserve. We're having a very hard time with that, because the rabbinate from Nuremberg, which is the closest big city, is saying we can't do certain things there. But there's a lot of activity to try to bring this to the fore.
So
I
it's
don't really have it.
a process.
There's a process, and it takes a long, long time. I did one thing. I just forgot about that.
Yes.
There is, in front of the school where this woman taught, because she's now retired, it's called the Stefani Middle School. There are like 4 enormous boulders. And at the end of the 2 ends of each boulder, there is a huge cross.
Ooh.
And in front of those boulders, well, it's a Christian town.
Right.
There are crucifixes in every classroom, in every store, in every doctor's office. It's amazing. You really have to get used to that. The separation of church and state.
There's no separation of church and state. None.
So anyhow, there's these boulders with these crosses. And in front of the whole thing is a plaque, a huge plaque, which says, these are the Jews who, no, excuse me, sorry, I said that wrong. These are the people from Gunzenhausen who died in World War I. And they have them alphabetically. Now, because I know who the Jews were in Gunzenhausen, I know who the Jews were who died in the war. I don't know, there's about 10 of them, something like that. And I mean, the whole community was only 200 people.
Yeah.
And I said, this makes me uncomfortable. There's a big cross, the names of these people who gave their lives for Germany. People would think, looking at this, that no Jew ever did anything for Germany in World War I.
Yeah.
She said, what would you like to have done? And I came up with the idea very quickly to engrave next to every Jewish name a Magen David, a Jewish star. We don't have to take away the cross.
Yeah.
We don't have to make a big deal.
Yeah.
Next to every, Louis Levy.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And so I left the town after I visited it, and my friend, this woman, Emmy Hetzner, went to the mayor and asked the mayor if that would be possible, and he said yes, and they did it.
Oh, good, good.
So I don't feel like doors are slamming. Not at all. I guess I just have to be sensitive. I'm a little outspoken. And when the mayor didn't like what I said about the commemoration, that's okay.
That's all right. Yeah. Those things are
If there's no conflict, it's not a real conversation.
Yeah, of course. Of course, Well, I have to congratulate you on this being a part of this ongoing communication with the people in that town.
Thank you.
I think that is an amazing thing to be doing, because it's on both sides of the issue. the Jewish survivors or children of survivors and the people from the town have to deal with a common history, and it's
That's true.
almost like a reconciliation commission or something,
That's right. That's right.
Dr. Reinharz, thank you. We appreciate you being here today with the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series. Thank you for all of this, the coverage and the stories. And there are a number of comments that are saying, thank you for the stories. Thank you for letting us know about this. And we do appreciate your being here.
You are more than welcome. And I'm happy to participate in this Yom HaShoah activities in the Southwest.
And we look forward to further conversations.
Absolutely. Goodbye. Thank you.
Be well. Okay. Goodbye.
Bye.